alternative futures. I am now going to hand the mic over to Kyle. So excited, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, my name's Kyle, and I'm traveling right now, but I'm living in Los Angeles near Ballona Creek on Tongva land. And I came to the arts through music and code, and I've spent a lot of time working with new technologies like machine learning and computer vision. And my work spans from this kind of like large scale installation to very personal performances and conceptual work. So this one's called Light Leaks, where I worked with Jonas Yongyan to project onto disco balls, and we mapped every single reflection of light. So this allowed us to control the space like a big LED display. And the calibration process is complicated or kind of complex, but when everything's finished, it feels like a kind of magical coincidence. So in this piece, the technology is more hidden from view. Other times I try to take advantage of repetition and multiplicity in a way that allows me to explore some sense of order inside some chaotic system, and the text may be placed more in the foreground. This piece is called Social Soul with Lauren McCarthy, and it's an immersive installation that tries to create a feeling of kind of being inside someone else's mind. We wanted to explore how it feels to be overwhelmed by the digital world, especially social media. So first the visitor types their Twitter username or their Instagram username, and then the installation shows all their text and images really quickly with text-to-speech kind of bringing their words to life in this kind of cacophony around them. And then all this content is used to pair the visitor with another person who had posted kind of similar content based on text analysis, who has been through the space before. And the installation sends them both a tweet to let them know that they've been paired up with each other, that they're social soulmates. So if you and your friend both tweet about the same things, then it might pair you up with each other. Sometimes I work as a technical or creative consultant. I helped build a drum sequencer with Google called Infinite Drum Machine, which was an evolution of a personal music project. I also worked with them with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology to organize North American bird sounds and make them kind of accessible in a different way with a different visualization than you normally see birds organized. We built a small hardware synth that uses machine learning to interpolate between the samples. And the most recent thing I worked with them on was a kind of visualizer for a year of humpback whale song recordings in collaboration with the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. This is a really kind of important part of what I do, even though it's, I think of myself primarily as an artist. I wouldn't be able to survive as an artist if I was only trying to write grants and get public funding and give talks like this. So I am not like in academia, I'm not teaching. So this part kind of helps financially to keep me afloat. For over a year now, I've been researching the ecological impact of the Ethereum blockchain. And that's why I want to spend a little bit more time talking about today, since this is like where my head is right now. In early 2021, this discussion kind of blew up on Twitter. We started to see this reproduction of the contemporary art market for the first time in the digital art space, with digital auction houses and huge sales and speculation and flipping and everything. And around this time, there's another artist named Memo Acton who created an NFT carbon footprint calculator. But instead of guiding the discussion, this tool is more used to shame artists for their involvement in this tech. So actually, I should step back for a second, because I know not everyone is familiar with this topic. So if you haven't been following this already, I just want to give a quick introduction. Ethereum is a cryptocurrency, which is like Bitcoin. So Bitcoin launched in 2009 and Ethereum launched in 2015. Both currencies use a system called proof of work to keep the network in sync across lots of distributed computers all over the world. Proof of work means that lists of new transactions are added to the database, which is also called a blockchain, only when a computer guesses a large random number correctly. So the first computer to guess this random number correctly gets a monetary reward, which incentivizes people to run these computers. And that process is called mining. So sometimes you'll hear or you'll read, some journalist writing that, mining is a complex mathematical puzzle, or it's solving a complex puzzle, but that is really like, it makes it sound way more honorable than it actually is. It's really just about guessing random numbers as fast as possible and hoping that you guess the right one. So you can think about mining kind of as the process of converting electricity into digital currency. At this very moment, there's probably somewhere around 10 million computers all over the world that are running full speed 24/7, converting electricity into Ethereum's native currency as fast as possible. And that's the system that artists are relying on when they sell work or trade work on this Ethereum blockchain. One really big important difference from Bitcoin for Ethereum is that Ethereum has the ability to run short scripts, which are kind of like little computer programs called contracts. And these contracts allow people to create abstractions and rules for how the currency works. And they allow artists to sell certificates of ownership. And that's what we call NFTs, or non-fungible tokens. They're basically certificates of ownership with rules about transfer. So when a few artists started making these huge sales in early 2021, they were relying on this energy hungry system. And some of the same artists who'd previously been concerned about the ecological cost of flying from festival to festival in hopes of building an art career, now they're concerned about this new polluting system and participating in this instead, whether that was better or worse or what. But this discussion was really foiled by the kind of details of what the exact scale of this damage was. It was a really contentious debate. And so I just tried to dig in. I tried to quantify this harm more clearly. Normally as an artist, I try to ask more questions than I answer. But in this case, I felt like I couldn't even ask the right questions unless I started answering a few of them in some way. And I think what ended up happening is I opened up a lot more questions for myself. It's been an interesting process. And I was hoping to show, that even though these systems might feel kind of impenetrable, if we take some care, then we can kind of quantify and disentangle them. They don't have to feel like something that's, unapproachable. Something I learned is that there's two very different problems involved. There's this technical question of total energy use of the whole system and all of its emissions. And then there's this ethical question or philosophical question, which is who is responsible for this? Usually these questions are really connected when you're talking about environmental concerns or, carbon emissions. When you drive a car, you're producing some quantity of emissions that you are personally responsible for in some sense, but in every extra mile produces extra emissions. But in the context of proof of work, these two things are kind of disconnected from each other. So proof of work is built a bit like the modem that you use to connect to the internet at home. So, you leave it on all the time, and you might not even know this, but basically this modem that's in your home will use the same amount of power regardless of whether you're streaming Netflix or checking emails or sleeping. Doesn't matter what you're doing with it, it's always using the same amount of power. This is basically how proof of work is operating too. It uses the same amount of power, even if there's a lot of transactions or fewer transactions, up to some limit in both directions. But basically, that makes this question of responsibility a little more complicated. And I'll come back to that. So to dig into this question of like the total energy use and emissions, I had to try and characterize the Ethereum network as a whole. How many computers are there? Are they using older, slower hardware or newer and faster hardware? How efficient are their power supplies? Are they in data centers that use a lot of electricity for cooling and lighting? And so I researched each of these questions, and I found that right now, Ethereum uses around 26 terawatt hours per year. And maybe you've never heard that number or that unit before, terawatt hour. So it's already a little obscure, but this begs the question, like, is that a lot or a little? We're not really used to these. We're used to like maybe watts for light bulbs, like a 60-watt light bulb or a 1,000-watt microwave. But terawatts is like really big. So for context, Ecuador also uses around 26 terawatt hours per year. This isn't a great comparison because Ecuador is not a computer, it's a country of nearly 18 million people. But Ethereum actually only has around maybe less than 1 million active wallets. We could also say that this number is around 0.1% of global electricity use. And if you bring all proof of work into there, like if you include Bitcoin, all proof of work is closer to 1% of global electricity use. Or we can compare it to Facebook, which is, all of Facebook takes about 7 terawatt hours per year to run. Or Google, which is actually not just doing YouTube and Google search, but it's running a lot of the internet using Google Cloud. Google only uses about 15 terawatt hours per year. And in, the time over the course of like 1 second, on YouTube, they're playing something like 50,000 videos at any moment. And Google's answering 50,000 searches every second, but Ethereum's processing around 15 transactions every second, just for a sense of scale here. After I looked into energy, I needed to understand for that electricity, what are the actual emissions associated with it? Because every country and region has a different, mix on the energy grid. And there's geothermal in Iceland or hydropower in South China. But Kentucky and Xinjiang use more fossil fuels. Energy mix can be represented with a number called the emissions factor, which tells us basically for every kilowatt hour of electricity. So if you use, a 1,000-watt microwave for an hour, that's a kilowatt hour. For every kilowatt hour of electricity, how many grams of CO2 are released into the atmosphere? And so for renewables, this number is really low. Like if you look at Sweden, it's almost completely renewables. And for coal, it can go up to 1,000 grams or a kilogram of CO2 per kilowatt hour. I wanted to make sure my research could be audited by anyone. So I put in like a lot of work and time to find these verifiable numbers, kind of one region and 1 year at a time. Then I averaged all of these emission factors based on where the mining is actually happening with Ethereum to try and get sort of whole network emissions factor, which is around 325 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, which is another way of saying that Ethereum is a little more renewable than most countries, but it's still not that sort of green, if you want to describe it that way. If you multiply that factor by the energy, then you get the total emissions. So that's around 20 kilotons of CO2 per day, which is about 7 megatons of CO2 per year. So a typical coal power plant emits around 3 megatons of CO2 per year. So Ethereum is something like 2 to 3 coal power plants. You could also compare it to like 4 million people in India or 500,000 people in the US. There's a really big disparity from country to country regarding emissions. Our emissions in the US are very high. So you could also compare this to like the yearly emissions from all private jets, except more people use private jets each year than use Ethereum. So that's sort of overall estimate, but I want to come back to this question of like who's responsible. It's really easy to sort of blame individuals, and I think that's one of the things that went wrong with Memo's work, even though it wasn't his intention. But I think part of the reason it went in that direction is because we have this really deep concept culturally of like the personal carbon footprint. I think what most people don't know is that this idea was invented by the ad firm Ogilvy for the oil company BP in the year 2005. This was like literally an advertising concept that was designed to redirect a sense of responsibility onto individuals and away from corporations. And I think when we look at these high emission systems like Ethereum, it's important to ask what we can do personally. And we need to like be careful with our decisions and kind of pressure each other a little bit and like talk about this stuff, but we shouldn't let that, distract us from keeping pressure on the organizations that profit the most. And in the case of Ethereum, the winners are mining companies, crypto exchanges, and marketplaces. I've been mostly focused on the marketplaces because most of the art that's sold on Ethereum goes through one of the main marketplaces like OpenSea or Rarible or Foundation, and they can take up to like a 15% cut. Rarible's recently incorporated a different blockchain called Tezos, which does not need proof of work. But depending on your analysis, there might be more than just the climate issues here. None of the other marketplaces have really shown any significant investment in rejecting proof of work. There's some organizations that have proposed that maybe blockchains or crypto could actually be a kind of foundational ingredient for climate coordination. And there have been some minor successes, like KlimaDAO has bought, I think, around 17 million tons of carbon offsets, which is driving up the price of carbon offsets on the voluntary market, which might mean that there's more demand for new carbon removal projects, which is something important that has to happen if we're going to continue to avoid the worst damage of climate change. But I'm really skeptical that these kind of market-based solutions can effectively scale. Usually making markets more efficient just seems to accelerate things instead of actually changing their direction. And I think we need some really big changes, as I understand it. So if you're looking for the most effective large-scale carbon reductions, they've mostly come from indigenous activists, and they've fought for years to against infrastructure that is 100 times the scale of what KlimaDAO is doing. There's some other organizations like Bitmo, which are trying to treat blockchains as kind of decentralized databases where countries can keep track and balance their responsibilities in accordance with the Paris Agreement. And I think that's a little more of a positive direction than this kind of voluntary market solution, because it's designed to use this tech in service of the will of the people and the will of the public. But as far as I can tell, it doesn't really solve any problem that can't be solved other ways. Let's see, I'm gonna skip that. So this ecological question is only half the discussion, as I hinted at. I'm usually quite critical of this ecosystem as a whole, of the crypto and especially Ethereum. But I want to say a few nice things about NFTs really quickly. They've opened up some new opportunities for people who previously had no access to the art market, and this includes artists living in areas without a network of galleries and collectors. It also includes artists working digital only. And it's also introduced a bunch of people to new kinds of digital art and generative art that they were just not aware of before. It's created a lot of legibility for this work that was unavailable. And there's a lot of visual artists experimenting with this for the first time. There's also a huge influx of money. It's complicated where it's come from, but if you're just looking at it from your perspective as an artist able to buy your home for the first time, that's a real difference, and it's hard to just poo-poo that. It also seems like people are just having fun with it. I've been watching it pretty closely, and there's a lot of people on Hiket Nunk was a really popular platform which had this kind of brutalist aesthetic, where there was a lot of collecting, and instead of having to appeal to a funder or a collector, you could just kind of ask your friends to collect your work, and that can feel a lot more welcoming sometimes as an artist. But even with all these great outcomes, arguably, there's a bunch of reasons I think we need to be careful here. There's of course these scams and fakes and hacks everywhere. And this is not really a bug as far as I can tell. It's more part of the design of the system. The whole system is designed around principles of deregulation. So there's nothing stopping scammers from downloading anyone's digital art and selling it. And there's even a number of prolific artists who have been they've basically been spending all their time for the last year trying to fight marketplaces to remove their artwork that's being sold without their consent. And because the entire concept of the blockchain is that it's kind of irreversible, there's no undos. So when a marketplace delists a stolen or fake artwork, the NFT continues to exist, and it might still be sold somewhere else. And even in that process, there's no way to undo the payment transaction, and the marketplace is actually making a percentage profit every time this happens. Another reason to be kind of concerned here is the rate at which NFTs are flipped seems to indicate that a lot of the purchases are more treating the artwork as financial instruments, similar to how the contemporary art market works. And this encourages collectors to sort of engage with art as more of like a casino style game. It kind of reduces the art to its monetary value and nothing more. And there's also things that people think NFTs solve, but they don't really. So, NFTs don't archive media. When you sell your artwork on an NFT marketplace, the only thing that's archived is the transaction history and the kind of sale and transfer history of that work. The media itself is normally stored on like a separate server, which might just disappear one day. I think my biggest concern here is that crypto as an ecosystem, it feels like it decenters people and humans. So on Web 2.0, at least, we were some kind of user, but in crypto world, we're just wallets. And that means if you want to build a system that redistributes wealth to people or systems that allow people to vote, we don't really have a concept of people to work with. We can only redistribute wealth to wallets and let wallets vote with money. And I don't know how to build something, really equitable out of that. But there are a lot of smart and kind people who sort of see this differently than me, and I'm still trying to figure it out. What is this tech actually leading to? Is it just a kind of, revenge capitalism, or is it something new and great? I want to spend like the last 2 minutes or so saying a few things about some other projects I'm thinking about recently, because I don't really have answers about the crypto stuff. It's something I'm really deep in, but it's evolving. So I'd rather kind of wrap up by sharing some volunteering work I'm doing for some folks in the Solomon Islands who are using ancient Pacific voyaging techniques, and another project around visualizing humpback whale songs to draw attention to marine debris. The voyagers and navigators I'm working with in the Solomon Islands are from this really tiny island called Taumako of about 500 people. And they've been there for hundreds of years, maybe thousands. And the wayfinding tradition that they're part of goes back about 2,000 years, let's say, 3,000 years maybe. They're really expert observers, and they know how to read everything from the sun and stars to swell patterns and animal life. And wind. And, I've basically been contributing to a project that they started in the early 90s to document their tradition in a way that will kind of help keep it alive and sort of make it legible to outsiders, which is something that they're interested in fighting for, let's say. One thing I've been learning from them is that I've had a kind of very individualistic view of technology until recently. They don't have any cell towers or internet on their island. So recently they've been talking about, like, hey, maybe we should install it. Maybe we should install the internet. What would that look like? And as I was kind of talking with them about this and learning about their process, I realized that this is exactly the discussion that we do not normally have around technologies like cryptocurrency. Instead, we sort of decide for ourselves whether we want something without considering the network effects of what powers it or who it might harm, or we sort of like build something and put it out there, to see what happens without really asking anyone if they need it. And I'd really like to learn how to have more of this kind of intentional and community-oriented relationship with new technologies. We can't always like be in a position where we just sort of like leave our island and try something and come back to have a discussion about it. But sometimes I think artists can create that sort of off-island experience temporarily and maybe provide like a preview of some tech before it's too late. I'm a really, really big fan of Lauren McCarthy. She's an artist who's really taken this approach in a lot of her work of sort of providing a preview of the future. And I'll finish with this project. So the second project here about humpbacks, I want to share a short story. So basically, back in the 1960s, commercial whaling was pushing a bunch of whale species towards extinction, and there were only kind of 7%, I think, of humpback whales were left compared to their numbers around the year 1900. And then something kind of incredible happened. So this US Navy engineer in Bermuda named Frank Watlington, who's pictured on the left here in this photo, he'd been assigned to make underwater recordings of dynamite explosions. And as he was working, sometimes he noticed these kind of weird, haunting songs in the background of the tapes. So he just spent years making recordings in secret of these songs on his own time. And then in 1967, two friends of his came to visit to do some whale watching on his boat. And he played the tapes for them. And he said, you know, I think these might be humpback whales. And this was a huge surprise because kind of the only people who knew that humpbacks could sing at that time were basically maybe local fishermen. It wasn't really common knowledge the way it is today. This was basically the beginning of that moment. So Frank's friends on this trip, they were named Katie Payne and Roger Payne, and they went on to press the songs to vinyl as this best-selling album, Songs of the Humpback Whale, which was this kind of cultural moment. Their goal was basically to like weave humpback songs into human culture, and by doing that, kind of reorient our relationship with these creatures. And it was massively successful. So today, humpback populations are back to around 90% of what they were pre-whaling, from 9%. Or what was the number? 7%, sorry. Other species haven't really been quite as successful as humpbacks. There's only around 300 North Atlantic right whales left. And one of the main dangers that they're facing is marine debris, which is kind of leftover fishing gear, which floats around and gets caught on whales, cutting through their skin and even like slowly digging into their bones. So to draw attention to this, I've been working with composer Annie Lewandowski to create these large installations out of recovered fishing gear. And we work with the Center for Coastal Studies in Provincetown, Massachusetts, to remove fishing gear from the ocean, basically. And then we work with scenic designer A.V. Rubin to hang it up, and we fill the space with humpback songs that Annie recorded with Katie Payne, who worked on that original record. And then I created some lighting design, which uses machine learning, and it kind of like draws your attention into the sound a little better so that you can focus on some of the really complex patterns within the humpback songs, which can be kind of difficult to pick up if you're new to listening. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of space for artists and other creative people to work with new tech in a way that reorients and reconnects us. And I want to help explore that space to build in concert with our community, instead of just sort of going out and like seeing, oh, let's see what happens if we try this, and to kind of build these better connections with our other kind of more than human relatives. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Kyle. That was really insightful. I'm seeing a lot of clapping emojis right now. So I would like to invite questions people in this room might have, and you're welcome to, raise your Zoom hand or, type your questions in the chat. Either way is fine. So I see Zashan having a question right now.
Hi, Kyle. Can you hear me perfect?
Yes.
Yes, I can hear you. Sorry. I could hear you. I can't hear you anymore.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now. Yeah.
So I'm also doing my major studio on blockchain technology. I'm also in the same, actually in the same boat. You're doing, you have done research, and I'm just analyzing the technology right now. Did you actually see centralized blockchain also? Because that also uses less energy, but that's not decentralized, obviously. But one of the thing is, my question to you is, there is other tokens which tokens like Cardano, who are promising that we are changing the code, it's evolving, that maybe we'll take less energy. These issues, and also one of my my question is, who owns the power in this thing, in this technology? Because all the DAOs, where the money comes from, because when I was also researching, Bitcoin was 0.01% Bitcoin holders own like 27% of Bitcoin money right now. So my question to you is that, did you see this path also, that who owns the power in all the system? Because the DAO have like there are only few people who are running the DAOs, and they are investing the money, and the system is, I don't know, like it's very early to say anything, but I'm also like in between asking a lot of questions about power and where the money comes from and where it goes.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'm going to try and break it down into two parts. One was a question about other coins besides Bitcoin and Ethereum, and then the other part was about who owns the power in these systems. So about other coins, there's a really great paper from UCL London where they basically do an energy analysis similar to what I did for a bunch of other proof of stake coins. And it turns out that they're very, I want to say high efficiency, but you need to put that in context. So they're very low energy consumption compared to proof of work. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're very efficient, because when you compare them to just a normal, database, they still take a lot of energy, and it's very computationally intensive. It really depends on whether you absolutely need a blockchain for your technology or not. So I would encourage, look at that paper from UCL. I think it's called. I'll put a link to it in the chat. About the question of who owns this tech, that hasn't been my research focus, so I can't say, but what I do know is more about the kind of ownership of the mining infrastructure. The mining infrastructure is fairly distributed actually within Ethereum and to some extent within Bitcoin. Bitcoin is more centralized than Ethereum is in terms of the mining infrastructure. You have entire companies in the US that own, something like 5% of the Bitcoin mining infrastructure, whereas with Ethereum, it's, I think, a smaller number, probably like 2 or 3% is the biggest ownership. So yeah, in terms of the mining infrastructure, it is fairly distributed. In terms of the money that is going into, crypto startups, a lot of it can be traced back to VC funding, to venture capital funding. It's some of the same people who are funding, Web 2. They're just looking for, maybe they're just looking for something new that can be exploited. It's a little hard to say. So yeah, if that's what you're researching, if it's about this kind of power structure, I really encourage you to go deeper into that. There's some other research that was published in Nature about the NFT collectors, and it's showing a sort of typical relationship of 90% of all of the sales are made, or sorry, 90% of all of the purchases are made by something like 10% of all of the wallets or something like that. So there's a really big kind of inverted relationship between, this, yeah, it's the same as everywhere else. It's really centralized in that way. So yeah, I encourage you to keep heading down that direction. There's a lot of questions to answer there, and I haven't really been focused on it for my work. Thanks for asking.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm also seeing a comment in the chat that seems somewhat related. T making a comment on Circles is a cool project that uses crypto, but not sure how energy intensive it is.
Let me see. I think Circles is a kind of UBI project, if I remember correctly. Yeah. Okay. So this one comes back to this question of personhood, basically. So all, like I was just saying about, yeah, it's complicated. I actually have a friend working on circles. I just remembered. This question about like UBI or wealth redistribution, in the crypto space, it comes back to the concept of personhood. How can you demonstrate that you are a person and that a wallet is yours and that you're not kind of using other wallets, or that you are not sharing a wallet with multiple people? This is not really an easy question to answer, because the only kind of solutions that have been proposed for doing this in a decentralized way that sort of maintains the integrity of the crypto ethos are either building out a kind of biometric surveillance system that is somehow distributed, or building out kind of locally connected webs of trust. And I think, if I remember correctly, I think Circles is using, as someone wrote, you have to know the person you're trading with. So I think it's based more on that web of trust idea. This is, in some ways, that's great. Like, that's how the world works. We operate on webs of trust. In other ways, it's kind of concerning because we're talking about building out infrastructure, which is like financial infrastructure at the core of society in theory. And we're designing it in a way that it doesn't really scale to like an entire country level, or like state level, or even like larger than a small community level. I'm kind of torn on this personally, because I don't know, like, if maybe, I don't know, maybe this is going to sound really naive, but as a bit of an anarchist, I'm not sure like which roles I want the state to perform in our kind of communities. And maybe there's something kind of, truthful about what crypto is discovering here about kind of trust at a large scale. And maybe we do need to take a, new perspective on what it means to build webs of trust and how we support each other. I guess one of my other concerns is that I haven't seen much of the kind of mutual aid and support that I would like to actually see from real communities happening in the crypto space. Closest thing is that I've seen, on Hicket Nunk or some other kind of more niche NFT platforms, I've seen artists kind of buying each other's work, which is something that was happening before too. It's just happening in a kind of open way that you get to see exactly how much people are making and who's buying what. I don't know if that really changes things in any fundamental way. I would like to see more fundamental changes.
Thank you so much for that. And I also see Dorje having a question.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, I just turned on my video too. Hi. Thank you so much for your presentation. I thought it was like fascinating, very, very insightful. And yeah, I just wanted to ask you about the Humpback, the exhibition that you had. So it's really interesting to me, because as a person that works in the machine learning industry, like whenever I deal with like machine learning techniques or use cases, it's purely for like functional purposes. But then here it's like, it's fascinating to me that it's more like it reinforces this core message that you're trying to convey in the installation. So my question really is, like, when it comes to things that are more creative or are addressing some really core community driven questions, is there a framework that you have in which you can place machine learning as a reinforcer that helps really like, I guess, magnify that message that you're trying to convey?
You're thinking of like sorry, I wanted you to clarify a little bit. So you're looking for, is there a framework for how to position machine learning within the context of an art installation, for example?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. I don't know, I guess maybe the one common thing for how I'm using machine learning is I tend to use it in a very exploratory way. And I don't normally use it to sort of answer questions or solve problems, which is the case for a lot of the code that I write usually falls into one of those camps. It's either answering questions and solving problems, or it's kind of used for exploration and sort of like, intuitive discovery and maybe some aesthetic gesture, So usually I'm working with these machine learning algorithms more in that kind of intuitive space. And I think part of the reason I'm attracted to that is because there's so many other people who are doing the other things. I feel like as an artist, I can kind of uniquely tackle this other direction. So with Siren, we were taking this machine learning algorithm called UMAP, which is for nonlinear dimensionality reduction, which just means, taking a big data set with a lot of data points and then sort of laying it out in a 2D space where similar things are close together and dissimilar things are far apart. And I found that to give me this kind of when I use that on data sets, it gives me this kind of alien perspective, like a very different perspective than a human perspective. It's something that reveals something almost mathematical about the data, or it just sort of changes the way that you look at it. And so if there's a framework, that's more of the framework for me. It's like, how can I use these algorithms to give me and my collaborators and maybe the audience some kind of new perspective on this topic that is maybe inaccessible just by the way that we normally look at things. Yeah.
And I think what you're doing is it's really like pushing that accessible part. It's amazing because a lot of the machine learning literature, as you said, it's really not accessible to the general audience. Like they would not really understand, like just the fundamental techniques. But then here it's like you're reinforcing it with like a very sensory sort of understanding, and it's awesome. I love it. Thanks.
Thank you.
So thank you for that. I'm going to point out the next question by Hannah. Just wanted to go back to your crypto work. What do you think the future of blockchain will look like? You think we'll move more to proof of stake methods as Ethereum announced their more energy efficient 2.0 version? How optimistic are you they will get there in the near future? Are you optimistic about the future of blockchain or more critical?
Yeah, great. I'm ready to play futurologist now. Let's go. The future, according to Kyle. Let's see. What do I think the future? I'll answer the easier ones first. So I do think Ethereum will switch to proof of stake before the end of this year. I think it'll probably be sometime in maybe late July. I've been watching that pretty closely, and the thing I've been looking for is the fact that they have these kind of test nets running where they're doing what they want to be doing on the main blockchain. They're doing it in a test system, and they keep looking for bugs, and the number of bugs that they keep finding keeps going down. So it seems like they're getting closer. They have been very optimistic for a long time, but it really looks like it's going to happen this year. Do I think that will switch more and more to proof of stake methods? I think really the only holdout here is Bitcoin. There's no way to switch Bitcoin. Bitcoin is doesn't have any kind of centralized development team behind it, the way that Ethereum has a kind of fairly active, more centralized development team. So I think the real question there is, will Bitcoin ever be rejected universally? And I'm really not sure about that. There was this opportunity just a few weeks ago for sort of some folks in European, the EU government, to reject proof of work coins, reject kind of holding proof of work coins, and they didn't go for it. They basically said, we're gonna let people continue to hold proof of work coins. That would have been a big moment because it would have signaled that it's more than just China that's not interested. But I think we're going to run into some really interesting problems soon. So earlier last year, China banned all kinds of cryptocurrency. They banned mining cryptocurrency. They banned holding cryptocurrency. I think something like 30 to 40% of all proof of work was being mined in China before that ban happened. And then it just disappeared. All that hash rate disappeared overnight. All the energy usage disappeared over less than a week. The reason that they banned proof of work and crypto is because, well, there's a few reasons, but one of the reasons is because there was a bunch of excess hydropower in South China during the wet season, and it was stranded there. They basically couldn't get it out. So they basically were incentivizing miners to come in and use it. But then China finished building, the Chinese government finished building high voltage DC lines that connect South China to some of the bigger cities in the east. And once those lines were finished, there was a really good reason for them to tell the proof of work miners to scram. So I think that as we build out kind of more energy infrastructure, like high voltage DC lines and other places, there's a really good chance that governments will say, oh man, this Bitcoin is really a drain on our energy infrastructure. We need to get rid of it. But we'll see. I mean, there's, the way that plays out, it's going to be really complicated. Generally, like optimism about the future of the blockchain or being more critical about it. I think it's really hard for me to say. It's like, I'm not super optimistic about anything that feels like an acceleration to me. And a lot of the blockchain feels like an acceleration. So to the extent that there are some weird things happening in the crypto space that haven't happened before, like those things I'm excited about. But most of what's happening in crypto is, basically more of the same. It's, reproduction of traditional financial markets. It's reproduction of traditional art market. It's just speeding it up and getting more people into the game. So that part I'm not really that excited about, but we'll see.
Thank you so much for that question and answer. I think actually as a follow-up to what you were saying, and maybe this is also another perspective to consider the future, is to consider historical patterns. So when you were talking about, I think parts of your talk, you mentioned that NFT, Ethereum, blockchain is designed around the principles of deregulation. And so I guess I'm curious whether you can just expand a little bit more on that, and whether you have examined this in a kind of like the history of economy, the history of marketplace, whether there's any kind of like comparison or patterns that you can share here.
I would love to, and it's a part that's not my expertise, but I'll say something really briefly about it. I'm like super new to this topic. I'm new to thinking about markets. I'm new to thinking about money. I thought I used to think I was like 100% anarchist, and then as I got deeper into crypto, I realized that I actually am quite a bit of a socialist to some extent, because I think that there's a lot of this like sort of distrust that's built into crypto that like I don't know, I don't believe in it anyway. Yeah, I'm new to all these topics, but I'll say kind of where I am for now. When I say that the kind of deregulation is built into the crypto ecosystem, they call it something different. They don't call it deregulation within crypto. They call it permissionlessness. So they say that they can do anything they want without asking permission. And that's what that kind of feeling is what I was trying to get at when I was mentioning like the way that we deal with technology more broadly. We say, oh, do I want this or do I not want this? Or do I want to put this out in the world or keep it to myself? This concept of like, okay, technology is this thing that we sort of as individuals get to decide what we want to do with it. It is the same as deregulation. It's the same as permissionlessness. It's saying that this sort of individualism is the highest value. And that anything that sort of seems to impede on individualism is a problem. And so in the US, this deregulation in the US kind of kicked off in the 70s. And there are kind of historical precedents for some of the things that are happening now. But I'm not the right person to talk about that. There's other people who could give you much more insight there. I mean, the thing that we maybe can see is that so far, nothing has gotten in the way of deregulation. The kind of closest thing that has made some pushback is like, there's some countries have taken more, like, even like the most left-wing progressive countries still have very neoliberal policies. They're still like pursuing these kind of like goal of free markets. And kind of taking their hands off as much as possible. I think, yeah, I'm If we're looking for historical precedents, I'm not confident that we're going to make it out of this alive. Yeah, sorry to be a downer.
Thank you for thank you for sharing that. And I think one thing that feels so bold, and I would say courageous too, is to see a artist, diving into the research that you did with Ethereum, and the carbon emission of it, which not many, not everybody have that training or even a clue of how to even begin. So I feel like for many of us who are researching on this topic, I just wonder if you could also share a little bit on your research methods, your methods of fact checking. What sources do you go to when you are trying to dive into a new field that you might not be very familiar with?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like so one of the last things I did before I published this paper is I found people who are real experts on, energy policy, energy markets, people who have been studying crypto for much longer than I have. And I asked them to review what I wrote. This is, typical within the sciences, but there's normally more formalized infrastructure for this idea of like peer review before something is published in a kind of, journal or conference or something like that. I didn't want to go that whole route because it's a very long process typically, and I felt like this was something that needed to get out a lot sooner. So I just went to people who I knew had kind of much more experience than I did, and I also engaged them, as I was doing this work, trying to like get their feedback and learn from them. I guess part of what I was trying to do there was get people from lots of different perspectives. I talked to people who were pro crypto when I was doing this. I talked to people who were part of mining pools. I talked to people who run their own, miners in their closets, like a little bit of everything. Something else that was an important guideline for me is I wanted my work on this topic to be based in kind of real numbers and observations, and as few kind of suspicions and imagination as possible. So I really tried to rely on discussions that miners are having on Reddit, and videos that people are posting to YouTube, and press releases from publicly traded companies that are doing mining. And yeah, there's a lot of information out there that's like, once you get kind of into the scene, like once you pretend like, oh, maybe, if I was a Ethereum miner, then who would I be talking to? What would I be sharing? Where would I be discussing this stuff? Once you get into that mindset, then you can start finding stuff really easily. So I think part of it is like, this is something I've done in some of my other work too, around like computer vision and machine learning. I try and get into the mindset of like being that researcher and try and take notes as I'm doing it. Like, what are the things that I hadn't considered until I was in this mindset? What are the, like when you're working with a machine learning algorithm and you've got some big data set, something that no one ever thinks about is there's always like a first row to every data set. There's a first image in every training image data set. And as you're researching and as you're doing like model training, you see that image over and over. You see that row over and over. And it sort of kind of digs into your brain in a weird way. And if you showed the first image from, ImageNet data set, or the first handwritten digit from MNIST to any machine learning researcher, they would see it and be like, oh yeah, I know that one. And there's all these little things like that where it sounds kind of weird and superficial, but once you understand the experience of actually doing the work in that field a little bit, I'm not a miner, I'm not a machine learning researcher, but I understand it a little bit. It gives me some new insight into kind of like how to more properly engage with the topic and the people who are experts, and how to kind of guide my research. So if someone else is trying to kind of go down some field like this that you're new to, I just encourage you to remember, like, none of these things are impenetrable. Like, you can always, even if you're not experienced, there's something that you can find there as long as you engage with people who are real experts. You don't want to go down this rabbit hole of like listening to people who are just as new as you. And you also don't want to get into the space of believing that like somehow you found something that no one else has ever understood. But as long as you can kind of continue engaging with experts, and you can ground your observations and ground your kind of ground your conclusions in kind of real observations instead of just speculation, then there's a lot you can do. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. We are at time, although there's apparently a few more questions in the chat. I was wondering, Kyle, if you want to just take a moment and pick one question to answer.
Yeah, let's see. So I see one from Richard and one from Hannah. I can say really quickly to Hannah, this social responsibility as an artist question, or thinking about the environment, this is really new for me. This is only maybe 4 years old, and it's it's just been a slow progression of realizing that part of what's wrong with, I think it's been very personal for me. It's been realizing that part of what I'm missing as a person is connected to my relationship to others and to the natural world. And that technology that I use on a daily basis has been kind of driving a wedge into who I am as a human. That kind of question of like, what is technology doing to me as a person started probably like 12, 13 years ago for me. But I think I didn't understand the extent to which it's also connected to the extent to which being a human is not just about our connections to each other, but our connections to, you know, what folks in Tamako call our ancestors. It's connection to the wind, it's connection to, you know, animals in the sea, it's connection to the trees, it's all these things. I think that's been a really, it's been an expansion of that original question of like, well, what do computers do to me? It's like, oh, wow, what is everything else doing to me? And actually I'll answer, Richard, your question really quickly, which is just, I have created an NFT before, and it was in 2019 with Casey Reese. He was leading the A2P project, where basically artists created these NFTs on the Bitmark blockchain, which is a proof of work blockchain. And we traded them with each other. So there was no kind of financial instrument involved. It was just a kind of art for artwork trade. And it was a lot of fun. I had a good time. I didn't know anything about proof of work at the time. I think there's space to make more work on blockchains or with blockchains that is kind of critical with or engages with NFTs in a useful way. I'm not like a never blockchainer or something like that. But I think artists need to be very careful about what sort of systems we support.
Thank you so much, Kyle, for all of your insights and what sounds like a really rich journey and trajectory. Thank you. I think many of us have classes, including me, so we gotta leave. But thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. It was really nice chatting, and thank you for all the great questions.